The Galactic King laughed at human mothers and their children in chains, calling them fragile breeders. He didn't realize that insult would be the spark that ignited humanity's wrath. This is how a single moment of arrogance brought an empire to its knees. 1,000 crystalline lights drift without weight in the high vault of the Grand Court, each a jagged shard of captured star stuff, casting cold illumination across an architecture built to intimidate. The walls are carved from a single seamless mineral that seems to drink the light, and the floor echoes with the soft, discordant hum of alien technology. At the chamber's focus, elevated on a dais grown from the same dark stone, the Galactic King lounges in a throne that is not a seat but a statement. Its angles are sharp, aggressive. It is a monument to dominion. His laughter cuts the air, a sound that is not warm. It is a tool, a weapon of spectacle. They bring the prisoners in, human women, their uniforms torn and smudged with the grime of capture, walk with their children clutched close. The little ones are quiet, their faces pressed into their mothers' legs, their small bodies trembling. The soldiers of the Empire guide them forward, not with shoves but with a steady, impersonal pressure. The mothers' faces are set, their jaws tight. They do not look at the king. They look at their children, or at the floor, their entire beings focused on containment, on not breaking here, in this place designed for breaking things. The king's voice booms, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. He calls them fragile breeders. He calls their children squalling spawn, a drain on resources, a biological redundancy. He details their weaknesses, their emotional ties, their need for shelter and comfort, framing each trait as a fatal flaw. This is the entire point of the gathering. It is a lesson for his court, a demonstration of why his empire endures and theirs has fallen. It is a show of strength through contempt. Amid the huddled group stands a man in simple, unadorned clothing. He is not military. He shows no rank, no insignia. His hands are still at his sides. Where the others are taut with fear or rage, his posture is merely attentive. He watches the king with the calm focus of a man observing an interesting weather pattern. His lack of visible reaction draws the eye. It is an anomaly in a field of expected terror. The king's gaze, sweeping his audience for effect, lands on this quiet man. The laughter pauses. A predator noticing the one creature that isn't running. He leans forward, the obsidian of his throne creaking. "You," the king says, his voice dropping to a more intimate, more dangerous register. "You stand there so silently. Do you not enjoy our little pageant? Does the fate of your people not move you?" The man does not flinch. He offers a slight, almost polite inclination of his head. It is not a bow. It is an acknowledgement, a signal that he has heard, and that he is considering his reply. The contrast is jarring. In a room vibrating with overt cruelty, his courtesy feels like the most subversive act possible. The king's arrogance, fully engaged now, has found its focal point. The insult has been issued. It hangs in the air between them, waiting for a response that is not yet given. The story begins here. The king's gaze stays fixed on the man, expecting to see the fear he has provoked in all the others. He expects a flinch, a lowered head, a sign that the spectacle has done its work. He gets stillness. The man stands like a rock in a fast-moving river, the tension and noise of the court flowing around him without effect. His hands remain loose at his sides. His breathing is even. In a hall built to amplify dread, his quiet composure is a dissonant note. It reads as weakness to the king. An empty space where defiance should be. Well, the king presses, the word a sharp prod. Does our entertainment not meet your standards? Or are you simply too broken to appreciate it? The question hangs, a challenge wrapped in scorn. The alien court watches, their multifaceted eyes shifting between the throne and this puzzle of a captive. The man lets the silence hold for a beat longer than is comfortable. Then he speaks. His voice is low even, devoid of the tremor the king anticipates. The spectacle is notable, Majesty. The words are chosen with the care of a man placing pieces on a board. The courtesy is absolute and utterly out of place. It is a formality observed in a slaughterhouse. This is not the language of a defeated prisoner. It is the language of an equal or perhaps a superior, momentarily condescending to participate in a lesser's game. The king misses the nuance entirely. He hears only the lack of fight, the absence of fire. He leans back, a broad, contemptuous smile spreading across his features. Notable. He repeats to his ministers, his laughter booming again. He finds it notable, you see? This is the best they can offer, a diplomat of notable events. They send their talkers to fight our warriors. He shakes his head, the picture of indulgent amusement. He sees a man who has been tamed by captivity, whose spirit has been crushed into polite platitudes. He does not see the calculation. He does not see how the man's eyes track the positions of the guards, the sight lines in the chamber, the patterns of the floating lights. He does not register the sharp assessing intelligence behind that calm gaze, or the controlled fury banked beneath the surface like a reactor at idle. The man's posture is not one of submission. His shoulders are level, his weight is balanced on the balls of his feet. It is the posture of a man waiting for a specific signal, a man who is ready. This calm is the first move. It is a feint, a misdirection played on a grand stage. While the king gloats over what he believes is a total victory, the human has already begun the real work. He has drawn the king's full attention, engaged him directly, and in doing so he has started a clock only he can hear. He is the still point, the quiet catalyst. Everything that follows will flow from this moment of profound and arrogant misjudgment. The spark is in the room. The king's laughter subsides into a condescending chuckle, the sound echoing faintly in the mineral silence of the hall. He gestures with a jeweled hand toward the huddled women. "This," he declares to his court, his voice rich with derision, "is what they called their defense force. Their warriors, breeders and their mewling young. They built an entire strategy around protecting this." He shakes his head, a show of theatrical pity. This fragility, this sentiment, it is no wonder their worlds fell so quickly. You cannot forge an empire from something that breaks so easily. The man watches him, his expression unchanged. He lets the king's words settle, lets the contempt hang in the air like a bad smell. Then he speaks. His voice is not loud. It does not need to be. In the vast listening space, it carries with the clarity of a struck bell. "It is a common error, Majesty," he says, the words measured and cool, "to mistake the foundation for the flaw." He does not look at the king. His gaze sweeps over the women and children, and his tone shifts, losing its formal edge, gaining a gravity that feels ancient. "You see victims. You see weakness huddled together for comfort." He pauses, and the pause itself is a weapon. "We see the reason walls are built, the reason fields are planted, the reason men and women pick up rifles they never wanted to hold." He turns his head back to the throne, and his eyes are no longer merely calm. They are direct. A man will fight for his home. He will die for his flag, but he will unleash hell itself for the woman who birthed his children and the small hands that hold his. The statement is delivered flatly, a simple recitation of fact. That is not a vulnerability. It is a fundamental law of physics, an equation. You have misread the variables. The king's amused smirk falters for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "This is not the script." "Is that a threat, little man? Do your breeders frighten me?" "It is not a threat," the man replies, his voice dropping even softer, forcing the entire court to strain to hear. "It is a warning from history, a tactical assessment, if you will." He takes a small, almost imperceptible breath. "Because, Majesty, it is unwise to laugh at mothers and their children." The words are precise, each one placed with intention. It is the surest way to transform a contained conflict into a total war. You believe you have defeated a military. You have instead insulted a species. He lets that hang for a moment, a dark cloud in the opulent room. Empires have cracked for less. The king stares, his face a mask of bewildered outrage. The warning, so calmly delivered, so devoid of bluster, does not compute. It is too simple, too domestic. He expected defiance, rage, a pathetic vow of vengeance. He received a lesson in cause and effect. He recovers, his laughter returning, but it is louder now. Forced. A performance to cover his own sudden unease. "Empires," he booms, throwing his hands up. "You speak of empires? You who stand in chains in my court? You amuse me, human. Your delusions are notable." He turns away, dismissing the man as one would a servant who has spoken out of turn. He waves a hand. "Take them away." The audience is over. He believes he has shut down the ramblings of a broken captive. He does not feel the first seed of doubt taking root in the minds of his court. He does not see the slight hardening in the postures of the mothers, the way their arms tighten around their children. The man's words were not a plea for mercy. They were a statement of consequences. The king's laughter was the spark. The warning was the fuel. The resistance was now inevitable. The king leans back, a wide, dismissive grin spreading across his face. The momentary unease is gone. buried under fresh layers of confidence. He has heard enough of this prisoner's strange philosophy. Power is what matters. Power is fleets and weapons and the ability to break things. He gestures again at the women, a sweeping, contemptuous motion. What power? He demands, his voice echoing in the hall. You speak of walls and rifles. I see none here. I see what you truly are. Unarmed. Captured. Your power is a story you tell yourselves to feel less afraid. What force can these breeders possibly wield that my empire should fear? The man does not smile. He does not frown. He simply watches the king, his head slightly tilted as if considering a complex problem. The silence stretches, and in that silence the king's bluster begins to feel thin, performative. You ask what power they hold, the man says, his voice so quiet the courtiers lean in to catch it. It is the only power that has ever mattered in the long run. He turns his gaze from the king to the women, and his expression softens by a degree. It is not a look of pity. It is a look of recognition. Our children, he says, the words simple and clear, are our future. That is a truth every species learns, or it falls. He pauses, letting the simplicity of the statement land. It is a universal constant, something so basic the empire in its complexity has forgotten it. Then he adds the tactical layer. The correction. And our mothers, he continues, his voice losing its softness and gaining an edge of cold steel, are our generals. The words drop into the silent chamber like stones. They do not compute. Generals command fleets. They wear medals. They issue orders from secure bunkers. They are not women in torn clothes holding trembling children. The king's face twitches in confusion, then breaks into a loud braying laugh. He looks to his ministers, sharing the joke. Generals! He roars, the sound meant to obliterate the absurdity. They command their young to eat their vegetables, perhaps. To go to bed on time? His laughter echoes, but it finds no purchase. The man's words hang in the air, unaffected by the noise. The king's amusement is a wall of sound trying to block a truth that has already passed through it. The man continues, his voice low but cutting through the king's fading laughter like a blade. You see a command structure of rank and ceremony. We see one of protection and legacy. A general issues an order to a soldier. A mother tells her son to run, to hide, to survive. The soldier may hesitate. The son does not. The order is embedded in his blood. It is older than your empire. He takes a small step forward, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. You hear a whisper and mistake it for weakness. You hear a plea and mistake it for defeat. Roars are often mistaken for whispers, he says, his eyes locking onto the king's, until they shake the walls. The king's laughter dies in his throat. The words land this time. They carry a weight that his own bluster lacks. The payoff is not in a secret weapon or a hidden army. It is in the understanding that humanity's greatest tactical advantage is its image. The empire sees softness, sentiment, fragility. They see a target. They do not see the infrastructure beneath it, the collective patient strength that is rooted in the defense of home, a strength that does not need to announce itself, a strength that simply endures and waits and remembers every insult. The king believed he was laughing at prisoners. He was laughing at generals, and he was too arrogant to hear the orders they were already giving. The king leaned forward on his throne, the polished stone groaning under his weight. The mockery had drained from his expression, replaced by a narrow-eyed curiosity. This was no longer about humiliating a prisoner. It was becoming an interrogation, a puzzle. The human's calm refusal to behave like a defeated enemy disoriented him. His entire understanding of power was built on visible, quantifiable force. This quiet defiance was a variable his equations did not contain. Enough metaphors, the king said, his voice losing its theatrical boom, gaining a sharper, more focused edge. You speak of walls and whispers and generals. This is not a strategy. It is poetry. A crutch for the weak. Explain it, plainly. What is your actual strategy? How did you believe you could stand against us? He expected a confession of flawed tactics, an admission of inferior technology. He was probing for a weakness he could dissect. The man considered the question, his gaze level. He saw the shift in the king's demeanor, the transition from bullying to genuine, if arrogant, inquiry. You believe confusion is a weakness, the man stated, his voice calm and instructional. A sign of a fractured command, poor intelligence, a failing mind. You are incorrect. He paused, letting the correction settle. Confusion, Majesty, is the seed of strategy. It is the soil in which it grows. It is not a byproduct of our efforts. It is the primary objective of the opening moves. The king's brow furrowed. This was not an answer. It was more wordplay. A seed? He snapped, his impatience returning. I ask for your weapon and you give me a gardening lesson. What does this confusion of yours actually do? What tangible advantage does it provide against a battleship? Against a legion of my soldiers? He gestured around the grand chamber at the manifestations of his raw, visible power. He wanted a schematic, a chemical formula, something he could hold in his hand and then break. The man remained unmoved by the outburst. He regarded the king with the patience of a teacher with a bright but stubborn student. It provides the one thing more valuable than any weapon, more valuable than any fleet, more valuable than any single soldier, no matter how well trained. He let the silence stretch, a deliberate weighted pause that forced the king to lean in, to actively listen for the answer he had just demanded. The entire court was still, the floating lights their only motion. The king's jaw tightened. Name it. The man's voice was quiet, final. Time. The word hung in the air, simple and utterly alien to the king's way of thinking. Time was a measurement, a resource to be spent on production and conquest. It was not a weapon. The man continued, his explanation cold and precise. Confusion buys time. Your fleets pause to reassess a threat they do not understand. Your intelligence officers waste cycles chasing ghosts we created. Your commanders hesitate, waiting for clarity that never comes. You look for the attack on the horizon, and you miss the corrosion in your foundations. Every second of your uncertainty is a second we use to dig deeper, to plan further, to move pieces you never knew were in play. You measure strength in the power of a blast. We measure it in the patience to wait for the perfect moment to light the fuse. Your empire spends time like it is infinite. We invest it, and we have been investing for a very, very long time. The king stared, his mind trying to process a battlefield where the most powerful weapon was a delay, a silence, a wait. He could not yet conceive of an army that won its wars not in the first furious charge, but in the quiet, patient years that came before it. The king shifted in his throne, the previous line of questioning leading him to a mental dead end. He needed firmer ground, something simple he could mock. He looked at the humans' plain clothes, at the tired faces of the other prisoners. He leaned forward, a new condescending smile forming. Time, he repeated, the word dripping with scorn. A fascinating theory. But let us speak of more practical matters. What do you people even eat down there on that little mud ball? Grubs from the dirt? Moss from the rocks? You look like a species that would scrape sustenance from the stones. It was a return to base insult, an attempt to re-establish dominance by attacking the mundane. He expected shame, a lowered gaze, a muttered answer about ration packs and survival food. The man did not lower his eyes. He looked past the king as if seeing another place entirely. His answer, when it came, was not defensive. It was a recitation, a declaration. Beef, he said, the word solid and simple. Roasted over an open flame until the outside is black and the inside is the color of a sunset. Corn picked when the kernels are so full of summer sun they taste like sugar. Milk so thick with cream it coats the spoon. Eggs gathered at dawn, still warm from the nest, fried in butter until the edges go crisp. He spoke not like a poet, but like a man reading from a manifest. A list of essential supplies, he continued, his voice gaining a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. The act of sitting together. A table, a shared meal, the sound of conversation under a roof that does not shake from orbital bombardment. These are not luxuries. They are the architecture of a day, the framework of a life. He paused, his gaze coming back to the present, to the cold court. And pies, baked with fruit from the orchard, eaten on a porch when the war ends for a single day. The temporary profound silence of peace, the taste of it. The king blinked, thrown by the specificity, by the sheer domestic normalcy of it. It was not the answer of a primitive. It was the answer of a man who knew precisely what he had lost. The king pressed, sensing a different angle. And your intoxicants? What do you drink to forget your troubles? Some fermented swamp water? A crude grain alcohol that burns the throat? The man almost smiled. It was a thin, hard expression. Coffee, he said. The word landed with its own quiet weight. Black as midnight, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Bitter as truth. Served in a thick ceramic mug. Hot enough to burn away the despair of a long night. It is not for forgetting. It is for focusing. for the clarity to see the work that must be done at first light. He held the king's gaze. We do not drink to forget our troubles. We drink to remember what we are fighting for. The king said nothing. The grandiose insults about empires and strategies had failed to land. This description of a simple meal, of a hot drink, had found its mark. The payoff was not in the king's understanding, but in the dawning realization among the prisoners themselves. This was not nostalgia. It was a reaffirmation. The king had tried to reduce them to their most basic animal needs. The man had instead defined their entire civilization by its simplest, most profound rituals. The king saw primitive consumption. The man had described the anchors of a culture. The reason for the fight was not a flag or a political ideal. It was the taste of pie on a quiet afternoon. It was the heat of coffee on a cold morning. It was the defense of a way of life so ordinary, so deeply loved, that its loss was unthinkable. The insult had failed. It had only reminded them what they stood to lose. The chamber's audience was a menagerie of silent observers, a gathered galaxy of delegates and dignitaries from 100 compliant systems. Their multifaceted eyes and expressionless faces watched the prisoners being led away, a display of imperial power staged for their benefit. They offered no protest, no comment. Their silence was a form of consent, a wary calculation of their own survival in the shadow of the throne. They saw the human women and children, the quiet man in chains, and they catalogued it as another lesson in the futility of resistance. Imperial guards moved in, their movements efficient and impersonal. They separated the group. The men were directed down one corridor of polished black stone. The women and children ushered down another. It was a classic tactic of control, a fundamental play from the Imperial Handbook. Divide the captives, isolate the elements, break the bonds that give them strength. The mothers held their children tighter for a final moment, a flash of raw fear in their eyes before the mask of stoicism snapped back into place. They went without a word, their silence louder than any scream. The king rose from his throne, the spectacle concluded to his satisfaction. He ignored the departing prisoners, turning instead to his circle of ministers and military advisors. They followed him through a concealed archway into a private council chamber, the air shifting from public theater to closed-door practicality. Their reactions were a muted spectrum. Some ministers wore expressions of faint curiosity, intrigued by the human's strange words. Military commanders showed open contempt, dismissing the talk of mothers and time as the delusions of a broken mind. A few, the quieter ones, the schemers, simply watched and calculated, their minds working through the angles, the potential uses for this odd, defiant captive. The man remained in chains. 2 guards flanked him, their postures rigid, their weaponry prominent. They escorted him not to the other men, but to a holding anteroom, a windowless space of the same dark, seamless stone, the door sealed behind them with a soft hiss of pressurized air. The larger of the 2 guards, his carapace gleaming under the cold light, stepped forward. The public display was over. Now was the time for the private lesson. He raised the butt of his energy rifle, a clear intention to strike the human across the face, to wipe away the calm expression, to teach him his place. The man did not flinch. He did not raise his hands or try to shield himself. He simply looked at the guard, his head tilted slightly. The courtesy was gone from his eyes, replaced by a flat, assessing neutrality. He spoke, his voice quiet and even, devoid of anger or fear. It was a statement of pure fact. You shouldn't have done that. The guard hesitated, the rifle butt held mid-air. The words were not a plea. They were not a threat. They were a warning, simple and absolute, like a doctor informing a patient of a terminal diagnosis. The other guard shifted his weight, his hand moving to his own weapon, a sudden unspoken tension filling the small room. The stage was now set. The public insult had been delivered and answered with words. The private confrontation would be answered with action. The man's calm was not a facade to be broken. It was the eye of a hurricane. The dignitaries in the main hall, witnessing the separation, the king's retreat, began to feel a subtle, creeping unease. The performance had ended, but the danger in the room had not diminished. It had condensed, focusing down to this single, silent man and the 2 guards who were only now beginning to understand that their prisoner was not the one who was trapped. Elsewhere, in a holding cell of the same seamless black mineral, the women and children waited. The room was cold, lit by a single sourceless glow that cast no shadows. The air was still, recycled, carrying the faint scent of alien cleaning agents and their own fear. The mothers sat on the smooth floor, their backs against the wall, their children held close in their laps or huddled against their sides. There were no words. The bravado of the public display was gone, replaced by the private reality of captivity. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, staring at nothing. They were holding on. That was the only task. To keep breathing, to keep their children quiet, to contain the panic that threatened to shatter the silence. It was a desperate, fragile hope, a thread-thin belief that the humiliation was the end of it, that survival was still possible. The atmosphere was thick with the unsaid, a heavy blanket of dread. Then a sound began. It was low at first, a vibration more than a noise, a steady, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It buzzed in the teeth. It thrummed through the soles of their boots. It was a deep, monotonous frequency that felt alien and profoundly out of place. This was not the sound of the palace's life support or its power systems. Those were a constant, almost inaudible backdrop, the sound of a living machine. This was different. It was an intrusion, a foreign signal injected directly into the heart of imperial power. It was the sound, the kind that comes in stories just before everything changes. It was the cue. A child looked up at his mother, his small face questioning. She tightened her arm around him, her own fear spiking, her senses straining. The hum did not fade, it grew. It became louder, more insistent. A steady mechanical heartbeat that was slowly, inexorably quickening. It filled the room, vibrating the walls, the floor, the air itself. It was a sound of immense approaching power, held at a steady, terrifying frequency. Then the alarms cut in. They were not the low hum. They were a shrieking, panicked cascade of high-pitched claxons that erupted from hidden panels in the walls and ceiling. The sound was deafening, a violent slash across the artificial calm of the prison. Lights flickered, shifting from the steady glow to a strobing, frantic red. The women jolted, clutching their children tighter, their heads snapping up, confusion and a wild, sudden hope warring with terror on their faces. The hum was still there, a bass note under the screaming alarms growing ever louder, a predator's purr. Then the first impact hit. It was not an explosion they heard first. It was a shockwave, a deep, percussive thump that traveled through the structure of the palace itself. The floor jumped under them. The seamless walls groaned, a sound of tortured rock and a long hairline crack appeared in the ceiling, snaking its way across the black stone. Dust, fine and gray, sifted down. A second impact followed, closer, heavier. This one was accompanied by the distant, muffled roar of an actual detonation. The opulent architecture of the fortress, a symbol of invincibility, was fracturing. The king's laughter, his boasts, his entire performance of dominance in the grand court was finally, utterly drowned out. It was replaced by the sound of his world breaking. The insult had been delivered. The warning had been given. The response was not a plea. It was a bombardment. The war he had laughed at had arrived at his front door. The boy pressed his face into his mother's side, his small frame shaking. Hours before, he had been a prop in the king's cruel theater, a squalling spawn paraded for the amusement of an empire. Now he was a terrified child in the middle of a battle, the world collapsing into noise and fire around him. His eyes were wide, unfocused, locked in a primal state of fear. His mother held him tight, her own face a mask of desperate protection, her body a shield against the chaos. They were a snapshot of pure vulnerability, a target for the violence ricocheting through the shattered atrium. A Marine moved through the controlled bedlam, his gray armor matte and scarred. He was not one of the ones laying down fire or planting charges. His task was the perimeter, the safe extraction of the captives. He saw the boy and his mother huddled against a fractured wall. He did not slow his pace. He knelt in front of them, the motion economical and sure. The boy flinched, pressing harder against his mother. The Marine did not offer a comforting lie. He did not say it would be okay. He did not pat the boy's head. He assessed the situation with a cold, professional eye. The mother was doing her job. The boy was a variable. Fear was a liability. It needed to be converted. The Marine unclipped a sidearm from his thigh rig. It was a standard-issue kinetic pistol, blocky and functional, its weight substantial in his gloved hand. It looked enormous, comically too large in the context of the boy's small, trembling form. He held it out, grip first. Not to the mother. To the boy. The child stared at the weapon, his eyes wide terror now mixed with confusion. He didn't reach for it. The Marine's voice was flat, filtered slightly by his helmet's vocoder, but utterly clear. There was no room for misunderstanding in the tone. "Hold this," he said. The command was simple, direct. It was not a question. It was an order. An assignment. The boy, conditioned by the sheer authority in the voice, by the sudden shift in the script, slowly uncurled one hand from his mother's shirt. His small fingers wrapped around the pistol's grip. He could barely hold it. He needed both hands to keep it from drooping. The weight of it was a tangible, shocking reality in a world that had become a nightmare. The Marine did not let go. He leaned in slightly, his helmeted face close to the boy's. "You're guarding your mother now." The words were not loud, but they cut through the din of the battle like a laser. They were transformative. The boy's posture changed. It was instantaneous. The sheer, numbing terror in his eyes did not vanish, but it was overlaid with something else. A focus, a duty. The abstract, overwhelming fear of the battle was replaced by a concrete, immediate task. Guard your mother. He was no longer just a child to be protected. He was a protector. His small shoulders squared. He tightened his two-handed grip on the heavy pistol, his knuckles white. He looked from the Marine to the chaos around them, and his gaze was no longer that of a victim watching a storm. It was that of a sentry assessing a threat. The Marine gave a single, short nod. He released the weapon, leaving it entirely in the boy's charge. He stood and moved on, his attention already scanning for the next point of contact, the next task. The moment was over for him. It was everything for the boy. The king had laughed at what he saw as useless young, a drain on resources. He saw a future slave or a corpse. The Marine saw a soldier. He saw the next link in the chain. He did not eliminate the boy's fear. He weaponized it. He channeled it into a purpose so fundamental, so deeply wired into human instinct, that it overrode the panic. The child was still afraid. But now he was armed. And he had a job to do. The king's empire was built on contempt for such things. Humanity's resilience was built upon them. The boy pressed his face into his mother's side, his small frame shaking. Hours before, he had been a prop in the king's cruel theater, a squalling spawn paraded for the amusement of an empire. Now he was a terrified child in the middle of a battle, the world collapsing into noise and fire around him. His eyes were wide, unfocused, locked in a primal state of fear. His mother held him tight, her own face a mask of desperate protection, her body a shield against the chaos. They were a snapshot of pure vulnerability, a target for the violence ricocheting through the shattered atrium. A Marine moved through the controlled bedlam, his gray armor matte and scarred. He was not one of the ones laying down fire or planting charges. His task was the perimeter, the safe extraction of the captives. He saw the boy and his mother huddled against a fractured wall. He did not slow his pace. He knelt in front of them, the motion economical and sure. The boy flinched, pressing harder against his mother. The Marine did not offer a comforting lie. He did not say it would be okay. He did not pat the boy's head. He assessed the situation with a cold, professional eye. The mother was doing her job. The boy was a variable. Fear was a liability. It needed to be converted. The Marine unclipped a sidearm from his thigh rig. It was a standard-issue kinetic pistol, blocky and functional, its weight substantial in his gloved hand. It looked enormous, comically too large in the context of the boy's small, trembling form. He held it out, grip first, not to the mother, to the boy. The child stared at the weapon, his eyes wide terror now mixed with confusion. He didn't reach for it. The Marine's voice was flat, filtered slightly by his helmet's vocoder, but utterly clear. There was no room for misunderstanding in the tone. "Hold this," he said. The command was simple, direct. It was not a question. It was an order, an assignment. The boy, conditioned by the sheer authority in the voice, by the sudden shift in the script, slowly uncurled one hand from his mother's shirt. His small fingers wrapped around the pistol's grip. He could barely hold it. He needed both hands to keep it from drooping. The weight of it was a tangible, shocking reality in a world that had become a nightmare. The Marine did not let go. He leaned in slightly, his helmeted face close to the boy's. "You're guarding your mother now." The words were not loud, but they cut through the din of the battle like a laser. They were transformative. The boy's posture changed. It was instantaneous. The sheer numbing terror in his eyes did not vanish, but it was overlaid with something else, a focus, a duty. The abstract, overwhelming fear of the battle was replaced by a concrete, immediate task. Guard your mother. He was no longer just a child to be protected. He was a protector, his small shoulders squared. He tightened his two-handed grip on the heavy pistol, his knuckles white. He looked from the Marine to the chaos around them, and his gaze was no longer that of a victim watching a storm. It was that of a sentry assessing a threat. The Marine gave a single, short nod. He released the weapon, leaving it entirely in the boy's charge. He stood and moved on, his attention already scanning for the next point of contact, the next task. The moment was over for him. It was everything for the boy. The king had laughed at what he saw as useless young, a drain on resources. He saw a future slave or a corpse. The Marine saw a soldier. He saw the next link in the chain. He did not eliminate the boy's fear. He weaponized it. He channeled it into a purpose so fundamental, so deeply wired into human instinct that it overrode the panic. The child was still afraid, but now he was armed, and he had a job to do. The king's empire was built on contempt for such things. Humanity's resilience was built upon them. The battle did not remain contained. It expanded, a fire jumping from a single spark to consume the dry brush of an entire world. Above the planet, in the cold, silent black, human fleets engaged imperial formations. They did not appear from hyperspace in a grand, declarative armada. They emerged from stealth, from behind moons and asteroids, their signatures masked until the moment they opened fire. The Empire's ships, once thought invincible, were met with a shocking, coordinated resistance. Their tactical displays lit up with threats from vectors they had believed were secure, their communications channels jammed with 100 different interference patterns. This was not a desperate last-ditch counterattack. The timing was too precise. The coordination too flawless. This was the execution of a plan. A long-game strategy, set in motion not when the palace was breached, but weeks, perhaps months before the first human prisoner was ever taken. The Imperial High Command, reeling from the sudden assault in space, received the first groundside reports. They were not reports of a planetary invasion. They were reports of a planetary collapse. At 12 major fuel depots across the continent, strategic reserves stockpiled for centuries. Massive explosions detonated simultaneously. No missile strikes were recorded. No bombers were detected. The charges had been planted days, maybe weeks ago, by maintenance crews, by inspectors, by low-level functionaries who were never noticed, never considered a threat. The Empire's logistics, the lifeblood of its military, began to hemorrhage. The command networks fractured next. A sabotage virus slipped into the planetary data stream through a corrupted trade manifest weeks earlier. Activated. It did not announce itself with a crash. It began subtly, introducing microsecond delays in communications, misrouting supply requests, scrambling target acquisition data for orbital defense platforms. Then it went for the spine. Primary, secondary, and tertiary command hubs went dark in a cascading failure. The Imperial military, a creature that relied on a centralized nervous system, was suddenly blind, deaf, and dumb, its limbs flailing without direction. The political foundation gave way. Long-standing imperial allies, species bound by treaties and threats, began to issue statements. Some declared immediate neutrality, withdrawing their support and their fleets from the conflict zone. Others, more bold, openly switched sides, their ships turning their guns on their former masters. These were not decisions made in the heat of the moment. They were the result of quiet negotiations, of promises and guarantees exchanged in the shadows over many cycles. The betrayals were not a reaction to the attack. They were a part of its choreography. The Empire was not simply being attacked from the outside by a vengeful enemy. It was crumbling from within, its weaknesses exploited by an adversary that had studied it, infiltrated it, and patiently laid charges in its deepest foundations. The patience the diplomat had spoken of was not a metaphor. It was the most devastating weapon in humanity's arsenal. It was the willingness to wait, to plan, to sacrifice the short-term victory for the long-term dismantling. Their diplomacy in the king's court, with its talk of time and mothers and coffee, was merely the slow-spoken version of the violence now unfolding. It was all one continuous strategy. The king had been playing checkers. Humanity had been playing a different game entirely. The Galactic King stood in the ruins of his throne room. The obsidian dais was cracked. Shards of the crystalline torches littered the floor like broken glass. The air tasted of smoke and ozone. The symbol of his empire was disintegrating around him, each percussive blast from above shaking another piece of the architecture loose. The Grand Court was a tomb, and he was its last resident, watching his own funeral. The hum of the human ship was a constant, oppressive presence now, the sound of a predator patiently waiting outside the door. He turned. The human diplomat stood at the entrance to the shattered hall. The man's plain clothes were dusted with fine gray powder from the fractured ceiling. The chains were gone from his wrists. He held no weapon. He simply stood there as calm as he had been hours before when the humiliation began. But everything else had changed. The power dynamic had not merely shifted, it had inverted completely. The king was the captive now, trapped in the crumbling monument to his own pride. The man was the free agent, the assessor of the damage. The king's face contorted, a mask of rage and bewildered denial. This could not be happening. His voice, when it came, was a raw, desperate shout, stripped of its former theatrical boom. It was the sound of a man trying to rebuild a shattered reality with sound alone. "You!" he yelled, the word echoing in the broken chamber. "You dare stand in my hall and mock me? You stand in the ruins of my power and you dare?" It was his last shred of bravado, a final, pathetic attempt to claim the narrative, to be the one delivering the insults. The man did not move. He offered the same slight, polite inclination of the head he had given in the court. It was not a bow. It was a punctuation mark. "Majesty," he said, his voice even, devoid of triumph or anger. It was the same calm, instructional tone he had used before. "I have not mocked you once." He let the statement hang in the dusty air. "I told you truths, and you laughed." The words were simple, final. They were not an accusation. They were a report. The sound that answered was not laughter. It was the groan of stressed metal from deep within the palace superstructure. It was the distant fading echo of an energy weapon discharging somewhere below. It was the complete and total absence of the comms traffic that should have been flooding his personal frequency with status reports and assurances. His fleets were failing, their formations broken by attacks they never saw coming. His supply lines were severed, not by a siege but by pre-placed charges and systemic sabotage. His colonies were in open revolt, their loyalty bought or coerced long in advance. This was not a battle. It was a coordinated, systemic withdrawal of his empire's very legitimacy. Every pillar of his power was being kicked out from under him, not at random but according to a meticulous, patient human plan. He was not being broken by sheer force. He was being broken by the dawning, horrifying realization that every word the man had spoken in chains was a precise prediction, the warning about mothers, the lesson on time, the description of coffee. They were not the ramblings of a captive. They were the components of his own autopsy report, delivered to him in advance by the coroner. He had not been listening to a defeated enemy. He had been listening to his own defeat, spoken softly and politely, and he had laughed at it. His failure was not one of military might. It was a failure of recognition. He had mistaken the truth for a joke, and the punchline had destroyed his world. The dropship hovered a foot above the scarred marble of the atrium floor, its engines a high protesting whine against the deeper thrum of the orbital battle. The ramp was down, a solid metal tongue bridging the ruined palace and the promise of safety. The rescued women and children were aboard. They stood in the dim interior, their faces pale and watchful in the red emergency lighting. The air inside was clean, filtered, a stark contrast to the dust and ozone of the collapsing hall. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a space existed around them that was not defined by immediate threat. They were safe. The word felt foreign, almost impossible. The human diplomat did not cross the ramp. He stood on the crumbling deck of the atrium, his back to the ship. The wind from the engines whipped at his plain clothes, stirring the fine gray dust that coated everything. His work here was not finished. His role had completed a shift, a quiet transition from captive to observer, from the man who delivered the warning to the man who would now oversee its execution. He watched the nightmarish ruin he had helped unleash. Flames licked at the shattered architecture of the Grand Court. Alien alarms still wailed a discordant counterpoint to the methodical sounds of the Marines securing the perimeter. He was a still point in the chaos, a calm figure assessing the scope of the destruction. This was not a victory celebration. There was no triumph on his face. His expression was that of a craftsman inspecting a job site, noting the progress, calculating the next phase of work. The rescue was complete. That task was checked off. The broader objective, the one he had alluded to in the chamber with his talk of time and consequences, was still very much in progress. The rescued watched him from the shadows of the ship's bay. They understood the cost. Their freedom was not a gift. It was a transaction, purchased with the calculated violence now unfolding around them. They saw the solitary figure he cut against the flames, and they knew his calm came at a price. He offered them no farewell wave, no shouted encouragement. His communication was a final, lingering look upward, through the massive hole torn in the palace ceiling. The stars were visible there, cold and sharp in the alien night, no longer obscured by opulent architecture. He looked at them not with wonder, but with recognition. They were the map, the board on which the next moves would be played. His stay behind was a signal, clear and unambiguous. The retrieval of the prisoners was phase one, a necessary prelude. His personal war, the one he had whispered into existence with polite, precise words under the king's laughter, was continuing. The ship's engines cycled up, the pitch shifting from a hover to a ascent. The ramp began to retract. He did not turn to watch it go. He was the point of the spear, and the spear was still moving forward. The dropship's engines cycled to a full-throated roar, a sound of contained fury that drowned out the fading alarms and the crackle of dying fires. It lifted from the scarred marble, a blunt gray shape against the shattered ceiling and the cold stars beyond. It did not climb with haste. It rose with purpose, a solid thing carrying a fragile cargo. Inside, huddled in the red-lit bay, the women and children were safe. They were the hope of humanity, extracted from the heart of the enemy's power. Their ordeal was over. Their war was just beginning. The diplomat stood on the ruined deck, watching the ship ascend until it was a distant speck against the constellations, then gone. He was alone, or nearly alone. The evidence of imperial collapse stretched around him. The grand atrium was a tomb of blackened stone and twisted metal. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, spilled fuel, and blood. The scale of the destruction was vast. An entire planetary command hub, a symbol of invincibility, had been broken in a handful of minutes. But it was not total. This palace was one fortress on one world. The war was not over. This was not the final chapter. It was the opening paragraph. This had been a battle, a sharp, violent correction to a specific insult. It had been a declaration, written in fire and delivered in person. But it was not the end. It was the establishment of a new baseline, a line drawn in the ashes. His vow was not shouted at the retreating ship or at the fallen king. It was not a cry of triumph. It was a statement of fact, spoken softly to the empty, burning hall. It was a promise made to the silent stars, to the unseen galaxy that had watched the Empire's arrogance and humanity's humiliation. It was a promise that this retaliation, this precise and brutal lesson, was not the conclusion. It was the prelude, the patience that had defined their strategy, the long, quiet infiltration, the sowing of confusion, the investment of time, now defined their resolve. The same calculated stillness that had marked his demeanor in the king's court now settled over the entire conflict. The fury was not spent. It was banked. The clock they had been watching for so long had not stopped. It had simply entered a new phase. The rescue was complete. The real work was just starting. He stood amidst the ruins, a solitary figure in the vast, broken space. The payoff for the entire chain of events, from the first laugh to the last departing engine whine, was a single chilling line. It gave the tale its closure and its new beginning simultaneously. It was not a threat. It was a prognosis, a forecast of weather yet to come. He turned his back on the wreckage of the throne and looked out through the breach in the wall, toward the horizon where the first hints of dawn were bleeding into the sky. The words were for no one and for everyone. Now the war begins. The king's failure was not one of force but of perception. He operated on a fundamental misread of the entire battlefield, a critical error in the opening assessment that dictated every wrong move that followed. He saw human prisoners in chains and logged it as a terminal condition. He saw them paraded through his court, and believed the display itself was a weapon, that laughter could shatter a spirit the way a hammer shatters glass. This was his primary miscalculation. He mistook captivity for defeat. He mistook humiliation for subjugation. In doing so, he broke the oldest, most basic rule of conflict. He failed to understand his enemy. His intelligence was purely surface level, a report compiled from what was visible and quantifiable. He saw the torn uniforms and registered a broken military. He heard the crying children and registered a biological weakness. His analysis stopped at the epidermis. He was utterly blind to the infrastructure of resilience that existed beneath the surface. The generational strategy that viewed children not as liabilities but as the sole reason for the fight. The cultural anchors, the shared meals, the bitter coffee, the quiet rituals of home, that functioned as a central command for the will to resist. He saw a finished product, a defeated people. He did not see the deep, patient machinery that was still very much operational. His empire's power was absolute in his mind because it was loud and visible. The grand court, the fleets, the ceremonial guards, the booming pronouncements. It was all a spectacle of dominance designed to be seen and feared. He believed power was something you announced. He could not conceive of a power that was quiet, a power that was patient, a power that did not need to announce itself because its confidence was rooted in something more profound than military might. It was rooted in the defense of home, not just a planet but the idea of it. The taste of food shared at a table, the weight of a child in your arms. This was not a sentimental notion. It was a tactical fact he was unequipped to process. His arrogance was not merely a personality flaw. It was a catastrophic intelligence failure. His entire apparatus, his spies and analysts and advisors, provided him with a picture of humanity that confirmed his biases. They reported on ship counts and weapon yields and resource allocations. They did not, or could not, report on the cultural psychology of a species that turns protection into a religion and patience into a weapon. They gave him data. They did not give him understanding. The payoff for this failure is a cold, hard lesson in threat assessment. The greatest danger is rarely the declared enemy on the border with the biggest guns. It is the one you dismiss as harmless, the one you believe is already broken, the one you laugh at. His laughter in that chamber was the spark that lit the fuse. But the fuel for the explosion that followed was his own profound and unshakable ignorance. He provided the reason. He defined the stakes. He handed his enemy a cause more powerful than any fleet, and he never saw it coming.
He entered the Grand Court as a prisoner.
His title was diplomat, but in that moment he was a symbol of a broken people, a representative of a civilization the Empire believed it had already digested. His weapons had been confiscated. His uniform was plain cloth. He stood in chains. This was the setup. The Empire understood physical leverage. It did not understand psychological pressure. His arsenal was not hidden in his clothing or encoded in a microchip. It was in his voice, in his choice of words. Each polite response to the king's mockery was not a sign of submission. It was a probe, a surgical instrument inserted into the king's arrogance, testing its depth, its brittleness. Each measured sentence was a calculation of patience and provocation. He was mapping the fault lines in the king's ego. Every revelation about human culture was a deliberate move. The description of roasted beef and sweet corn was not nostalgia. It was an assertion of identity, a declaration that what they fought for was not an abstract political concept, but a tangible way of life. The definition of mothers as generals was a reframing of reality. It was a tactical briefing delivered under the guise of a philosophical statement. He was not sharing information. He was laying charges. His warning was the core of the strategy. Empires have cracked for less. It was not a boast. It was not a plea. It was a forecast, a delivery of strategic intelligence to an enemy who was too arrogant to receive it. He told the king exactly what would happen. He provided the cause and the effect. The king, believing only in the power he could see, dismissed it as the rambling of a defeated man. He missed the entire briefing. His calm was the critical shield. It was not simply a personality trait. It was active camouflage. It hid the timing. While the king focused on breaking the man's composure, the man was counting down. His stillness masked the movement of fleets entering position. His politeness concealed the activation of sabotage codes. His entire presence was a diversion, a magician's gesture drawing the eye away from the real trick. The attack did not come as a surprise because it was secret. It came as a surprise because it was announced in plain sight by a man the king refused to take seriously. He was, in the most literal sense, a terrible diplomat. His goal was not negotiation or compromise. His mission was not peace. His dialogue was a countdown. Each exchange brought the inevitable response 1 second closer. He used the language of diplomacy the way a sapper uses explosives, not to build bridges but to blow them. The payoff is a fundamental redefinition of the term. Diplomacy in this context is not the art of peace. It is a form of explosive force. It is strategy spoken slowly and with precision, a long drawn-out fuse that burns with every word until it finally reaches the powder keg. It is the patient application of psychological pressure until the structural integrity of the opponent's arrogance fails. The talking ends. The enacted violence begins. The two are not separate actions. The conversation was the first volley. The attack was the last word. The story ended. Its implications began. Across 100 star systems on 1,000 worlds, the news spread not as a military report, but as a shockwave. The galaxy watched. They saw the unthinkable. A mighty empire, a power that had dominated local space for centuries, fell in a single day. Its collapse was not a slow decay. It was a structural failure, a fortress dissolving into dust and fire between one dawn and the next. The event was measured not in battles won or lost, but in the absolute silence that replaced the imperial broadcast channels. The silence was more terrifying than any declaration of war. The source of the collapse was traced back, not to a fleet engagement, not to a new superweapon. It was tracked to a moment of pure arrogance weeks earlier, in a chamber of judgment. A galactic king laughed at the wrong prisoners. He mocked the wrong children. The instigating incident was not an attack. It was an insult. The entire catastrophic chain of events, the burned-out fuel depots, the shattered fleets, the betrayals, all of it was the direct consequence of that one public display of contempt. A single spark, carelessly dropped, the whisper of a captive in chains standing before that throne, proved to be a sound that carried further than the roar of imperial fleets. His quiet warnings, dismissed as the ramblings of a broken man, were later dissected by strategists across known space. They were not ramblings. They were a precise forecast, a statement of cause and effect delivered with the calm certainty of a man reading a weather report. The Empire's greatest strength, its loud, visible, overwhelming force, was revealed as a liability. It was a roar that drowned out its own ability to hear the whisper that would destroy it. The defense of mothers and their children was re-evaluated. It was no longer seen as a sentimental weakness, a biological softness to be exploited. It was recognized as the most powerful motivator in the known universe. It was a force that could make men and women endure endless hardship and then, when provoked, unleash a calculated, patient wrath that could shatter worlds. Imperial conquest based on resource acquisition and territorial expansion was a shallow ideology next to it. One was a game of real estate. The other was a holy war. The patience of the long game was studied. Military academies scrambled to rewrite their doctrines. The spectacle of immediate force, the doctrine of shock and awe, was suddenly viewed as primitive. It was a child's strategy. The human approach, infiltration, misdirection, the willingness to invest years for a single, perfect moment of retaliation, was recognized as a higher form of warfare. It was chess to the Empire's checkers. Humanity's image was permanently altered. They were no longer the fragile newcomers, the sentimentalists who valued family over power. They were seen as relentless, strategically profound, a species that could hide an iron fist inside a velvet glove for generations, waiting for the perfect reason to clench it. Their politeness was reassessed. It was not weakness. It was a threat assessment, a warning label. The king's laughter is now a cautionary tale. It is told in strategy sessions and command schools across the galaxy. It is not a story about a battle. It is a lesson in political physics, a lesson about the nature of power. The final insight is the simplest and the most easily forgotten. True power does not always reside in the dreadnought or the palace. It often lives in the most underestimated places, in the quiet resolve of a parent, in the patient planning of a diplomat, in the simple, unbreakable will to defend a way of life. It is a lesson written in the cooling ruins of a chamber of judgment, for any empire arrogant enough to read it. The Galactic King laughed, An empire fell. Remember this. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one shouting threats. It's the one speaking truths you refuse to hear. This isn't just a revenge story. It's a lesson in strategic patience. The power of a cause that unites everyone. Consider the whispers you might be mistaking for weakness in your own world. The war doesn't begin with the bang of a gun. It begins with a single spark of disrespect. It ignites when that spark meets a cold, calculated resolve that was waiting for it all along.